Why are so many Americans in prison? Prager U wants to know. Let's find out.
Our prisons are crowded with people who shouldn't be there, the victims of a racist justice system. This is the popular progressive narrative, but it's wrong in every respect. Dangerously wrong. The US does have a very large prison population, not because too many innocent people are incarcerated, but because too many people commit serious, usually violent crimes. With rare exceptions, that's why most people are imprisoned in America. Period. Full stop. Before presenting the facts, let me add these.
I absolutely love when PragerU does bullshit like this, where they say, why are people in prison? Well, it's not because the system is racist, it's because they committed crimes. Okay. Why did they commit those crimes? Well, reasons. Could it possibly be the socioeconomic background they grew up in caused them to feel the only way to live a better life was to commit those crimes? Is that a possibility, PragerU? Is it possible that due to a desire to crack down on crimes, a greater focus was put on so-called higher crime areas, so those areas had higher crime? Statistically? Could be. Could be. Is it that sentencing is very much harsher for black and brown people than it is for white people? Could be. Could be. I don't know, PragerU, what is it? What do you think?
These caveats. It's unacceptable that any innocent person is behind bars. Punishment must always fit, not exceed the crime. We should do everything we can to reduce the
Except that a lot of our supposed punishments exceed the crime. Why should you spend years in jail, for possession of weed? I'm ignoring the death penalty here, because I don't think that the death penalty should be on the table for any crime. And yes, I agree, it is abhorrent to put an innocent person in jail. And I agree with the old saying about the U.S. justice system, better to let 10 guilty men go free than to put one innocent man in jail. The problem is that our system is broken, and the determiner of whether you get to walk free or not is not your guilt or innocence, it's your bank account. It's whether you can afford to fight what you're being accused of. And for many people, even if they could afford it in the sense that they have the extra money, they can't afford to take the time off work to do so. Or whatever. Take the time off from whatever they're doing to do so. There's a lot of people in prisons and jails simply because they didn't have the time or resources to defend themselves against a fake crime.
the rates of recidivism, committing more crime after release. And finally, everyone in prison should be treated humanely. But let's not fool ourselves that our prisons are full of people who shouldn't be there. That's simply not the case. Let's start with those convicted of drug offenses, the source of so much of the mass incarceration myth. While it's true
Mass incarceration. What is the per capita rate of incarceration in America? 716 per 100,000. More than 5 times higher than most other countries in the world. Yeah. Now, all sorts of neat graphs here. With Iceland, Japan, Venezuela, we imprison more than 7 times as many people as the socialist hellhole that is Venezuela, at least according to these people. Italy, Netherlands, Canada, Australia, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. Well, sure, China and Russia, but they don't claim to be bastions of freedom either. I mean, they might, but no one believes them. But look at this, Saudi Arabia. We imprison, again, almost 7 times as many people per 100,000 in as Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia! And we're supposed to believe that our justice system is just and fair and a good thing. Yeah.
True that about half of federal prisoners are incarcerated on drug charges, federal inmates constitute only about 12% of the American prison population. Almost 9 of every 10 prison inmates are in state facilities, and very few of them, less than 15%, are there for drug-related offenses. 4 times that number.
Right. But the issue is that because of mandatory minimums and 3 strike laws, people are going to prison for years because they were caught with a joint, or they were pulled over for a bad taillight or something, and the cop smelled weed and searched them and found a roach or a bag on them. You know, I'm not going to say they're always innocent or whatever. But these people are going to jail for years for what I think America is finally realizing is the equivalent of having a six-pack in their car. Like, not open, just sitting in the back seat or whatever. Because to go from a bag of weed to smoking is a little bit more difficult than popping the top on a can. So if you got a bag of weed in your pocket, that's not the same as an open can of beer. I'm sorry, I know there's a lot of people who try to make that claim, and I'm not going to sit here and say that there's a difference between drunk driving and stoned driving. There isn't. It's still impaired, it's still something you should avoid doing. But to try to say that someone with a bag of weed in their pocket is committing the same crime as someone with an open can of beer next to him, you know, morally, ethically, consequentially, no. Sorry. So even if this is a small fraction of drug charges, this is ignoring the number of people who don't go to prison for drug charges, but nonetheless have them on their record. I know a number of people who have never seen the inside of a jail cell, but have multiple drug charges on their record. And the problem is that most of those people are white. That's why they don't see the inside of prison.
Are behind bars for one of the following serious crimes: murder, 14%, rape or sexual assault, 13%, robbery, 13%, aggravated or simple assault, 11%, and burglary, 9%.
So wait, if I'm reading this here, then drug-related charges still make up a plurality of the reasons someone is in prison. This is what they do. They make it sound like, well, they're only 15%. Murder is only 14%. And yes, if you add up all these others, then they're more than... But I think murder is worse than... Well, no, rape or sexual assault is worse than any of these up here. But, I mean, it's only 13%, so it's not really an issue. Come on, Prager U. This is what they do. They use technically correct and true statements to mislead you about reality. Because if drug-related charges make up 15% of prison inmates, and there's no other category that is, you know, there's none that's 16 or 17 or 20%, then that means a plurality. Most of the people in prison are there for drug-related charges. That's how numbers work. This is how they lie to you.
In short, violent criminals make up the clear majority of the state prison population. What's more, drug offenders...
Yes, if you divide it into violent versus non-violent, of course, robbery isn't necessarily violent. Neither is burglary. Actually, again, this is how they lie to you. Robbery and burglary are not necessarily violent. In fact, most burglars I've known... I've only known one person who admitted to burglarizing a house. I don't talk to him anymore. But most burglars probably don't want to get violent. They want to get in, get the shit, and get out without encountering anyone. Because the charge for burglary is one thing. The charge for assault is another. And robbery? And, I mean, yes, all of these are a kind of violence. If we consider doing harm, burglary is violence, robbery is violence. But what they mean by violent crime is not what a leftist considers violence. What they mean by violent crime is you committed physical harm on a person. Murder is definitely violent in that way. Rape, sexual assault, definitely violent. Aggravated or simple assault, of course it's violent. Burglary? It harms the person in their home, but it doesn't physically harm them. And robbery? Generally, if a robbery harms someone, it becomes an assault. Again, this is how they mislead their audience, by conflating all sorts of things to make their narrative sound good.
Offenders who do end up in prison don't actually serve very much time. Almost half are released within a year. The truth is that most criminals probably spend less time in prison than you think, even for the most violent crimes. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, almost 40% of released state prisoners served less than a year in prison. Even 20% of murderers and nearly 60% of those convicted of rape or sexual assault served less than 5 years in prison.
Okay. Bureau of Justice Statistics. Okay, time served in prison. So, the median time served in state prison before initial release for murderers is just shy of 14 years. So even if 40% of people convicted of murder, and I'm assuming, is that what he said? Convicted of murder?
State prisoners served less than a year in prison. Even 20% of murderers and nearly 60% of those convicted of rape or sexual assault served less than.
Okay. So the issue with this is that a lot of rape and sexual assault cases don't get processed, and a lot of times they don't get very harsh sentences. I mean, what did Weinstein get? 40 years, something like that? No, he got 23 years. Yeah, 23 years in prison. Harvey Weinstein. For this list of credible accusers, he got 23 years. So someone who got carried away, misread signals, a one-time mistake. Yeah, they're not going to get very long punishment because apparently rape isn't punished that harshly. And of course, now Weinstein's getting out for fucking COVID. So yeah, this, again, he's right. People don't understand how long people spend in prison for different crimes. And they don't understand that for a lot of people, a lot of first offenses, especially for these kind of crimes, you don't always just get life in prison for killing someone. And again, completely not qualifying what they mean by murders. That could be someone who, like, some kid who is driving a little recklessly, hits someone with their car and kills them. It's tragic. It's awful. I don't know that they necessarily need to spend time in prison for it, but that's what society deems, so they spend time in prison. And then they get out, and yeah.
5 years in prison. What explains the short stays? Answer: plea bargaining. Most prosecutions never go to court. Instead, a deal is made between the defendant's attorney and the prosecutor to avoid going to trial. These negotiations often involve the offender.
I'm curious where they're going to come down on plea deals, because plea deals are good if you have a good attorney because they let you avoid prison. And obviously, I'd like plea deals to only be available for people who are actually guilty, but obviously that's an impossibility. So what I'm saying here is that the problem with plea deals is that they're often used to essentially coerce a guilty plea out of someone who may not have done it in order to avoid a lengthy court battle that they maybe can't afford.
Offender agreeing to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence or dropping or downgrading the most serious charges. As a result, a prisoner's conviction record often understates the crime that landed him behind bars in the first place. For example, an armed.
Right, because if you have evidence that this person robbed a liquor store, okay, you can either try to prove aggravated assault and robbery, or you can just get them for simple robbery. Now, one of those is really easy to prove, and you almost definitely have the evidence for it. One of those is harder to prove. This is another reason why charges often get argued down, because they can prove X, but they can't prove X plus 2. They can prove robbery, but they can't prove aggravated assault and robbery.
A burglar who, when arrested, was found to be in possession of illegal drugs might go to prison not for his worst crime, the armed burglary, but for a plea bargain charge of, say, trespass and drug possession. But the media and the activists don't tell us about this rather important detail. Instead, all we hear about is the poor fellow who's serving time for selling a small amount of cocaine. This assumes, of course, that the convicted criminal does any time at all. Studies done by the Justice Department show that only about 40% of felony convictions lead to a prison sentence. Yes, many are given probation, sentenced to home confinement, or given credit for time served in pretrial detention. But most of the time, convicted criminals don't go to prison. Do we really want even more criminals out on the street? Activists say yes. Scholars at the left-leaning Brennan Center have called for an immediate 40% reduction in the number of inmates. CNN host Van Jones, founder of the #Cut50 initiative, tops that. He wants a 50% reduction. But if the activists get their way, the cost would be high and would likely be paid by the most vulnerable. Most crimes are committed by a small fraction of the population who primarily victimize their own communities. Here's an all too common example. In the spring of 2019, 2 men were charged with the murder of a Chicago woman who was shot while holding her baby. One of the men charged had 9 felony convictions, including for a 2004 second-degree murder charge. A January 2017 University of Chicago crime lab study found that on average, someone arrested for a homicide or shooting in that city had nearly 12 prior arrests. Almost 20% had more than 20. If we cut prison rolls by 20, 40, or 50%, it won't be politicians and media.
Okay, let me find this study, because I'm guessing these are going to be minor crimes. Like, obviously they had that prior example where someone had been convicted for a second-degree murder. Okay, this looks to be it. A report from the University of Chicago Crime Lab released Tuesday examines Chicago's increase in gun violence last year and considers that what made 2016 such a violent year. Gee, I wonder. The goal of the report, according to Jens Ludwig, is to help the city better understand exactly what happened with the hopes of avoiding another year of the future like the one that just passed. Okay, 58%. What we are experiencing in Chicago is not a complete breakdown of social order so much as a dramatic increase in some combination of people's willingness to take guns into public places and their willingness to use them against others. Examine the geography of the increase in fighting. The suddenness of the increase in gun violence we saw at the end of 2015 helps rule out many candidate explanations for why there are so many more shootings now in Chicago. Despite strong claims by both... Okay, so the most controversial explanation for why gun violence rates increase so much is changes at the Chicago PD. Despite strong claims made by both sides in the political debate, the Crime Lab report notes that there is no evidentiary basis to draw clear conclusions one way or the other at this point. On the one hand, one of the few changes that fits the timing of the increase in gun violence is a large drop in the number of street stops carried out by the Chicago PD, which declined by about 80%, okay, without any increase in gun violence. We also need some explanation for why that type of change would have such different impacts across cities, which remains poorly understood at present. So, New York stop and frisk, we didn't see an increase in gun violence. Chicago stop and frisk, we saw an increase in gun violence. So what is the confounding variable here there? Okay, this is probably the whole... Okay, so more often than not having some... Okay. So this looks to be the actual report. The other one was just kind of a summary. Around 80% of Chicago's homicide victims in 2015 and 2016 had at least one prior arrest. Almost 40%... So this is victims, and almost 30% had a prior gun arrest. Nearly 40% of victims had more than 10 prior arrests, while the share... Okay. So this is victims. Okay. Suspects. Okay. Individual arrests for a homicide or shooting in Chicago 2016 had similar prior criminal records. Around 90% had at least one prior arrest, approximately 50% had a prior arrest for a violent crime specifically, and almost 40% had a prior gun arrest. The average person arrested for a homicide or shooting in both years had nearly 12 prior arrests, with almost 45% having had more than 10 prior arrests, and almost 20% having had more than 20 prior arrests. So they are using valid data here, but again, these are people who ostensibly served their time or were on probation, or whatever. As we can see, there are actually fewer people in 2016 who had had a prior arrest at all, and who had prior violent crime or gun arrests. So, yeah, again, this is making it look like Chicago is letting people out onto the streets who, they're violent killers and criminals, but the reality is they served their time, they paid their debt, and then they were released as they were supposed to be, and continued committing crime because they had nothing else to do. Again, Prager U lying to its viewers. Love to see it.
Found that on average, someone arrested for a homicide or shooting in that city had nearly 12 prior arrests. Almost 20% had more than 20. If we cut prison rolls by 20, 40, or 50%, it won't be politicians and media celebrities living in gated communities who will pay the price. It will be the law-abiding citizens in underserved neighborhoods struggling to get ahead who will pay. When it comes to debates about...
Actually, that's probably not as true as he thinks it is. A lot of criminals prefer to target gated communities because they tend not to have patrols the way that the ghetto does. Like, if you can get into a gated community, then while there may be alarms and there may be some private security, that kind of thing, they're much less likely and also much higher reward for robberies committed there than robberies committed in, like, a poorer part of town. So it's not necessarily true that the people most at risk if we release these people are those in underserved neighborhoods. It may very well be those gated communities.
About criminal justice policy, these people, not criminals, should come first. I'm Rafael Mengual, Deputy Director of Legal Policy at the Manhattan Institute for Prager University.
Yeah, I love when these right-wingers, when they talk about how much they feel for the poor and underserved, and it's like, no you don't. You're just using them as a crutch to make people scared of criminals, so that they'll want to keep them locked up more, so you can continue disenfranchising people who look like you. Prager U is such a disingenuous, lying channel, and they have the audacity to cry to the courts about being silenced. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. If you liked it, like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. Thank you. See you next time.